Chapter 2: The Commencement of World War II. Following the Munich crisis of 1938 and the initial euphoria over the possibility of peace in our time, a period of uneasiness over the future emerged. It became apparent that Hitler, in particular, was not satisfied with just the conquest of Czechoslovakia. A new crisis started to develop over Hitler's demands for access through the then Danzig corridor in Poland. Meanwhile, Britain had started to urgently establish an effective air and civil defense, with extensive build-ups in anti-aircraft gun batteries, searchlight batteries, fighter defenses and air raid precautions. Sir John Anderson, who, as Minister of Civil Defense, arranged for shelters made of corrugated iron to be issued to all households, which were named after him. The shelters were set up in gardens by digging trenches, placing the shelters in the trench and covering them with earth and sandbags. The factory I worked at also constructed a network of underground concrete shelters, to which all the factory workers could be evacuated in the event of air raids. I remember Sir John Anderson visiting the factory I worked at, to watch an orderly evacuation by workers from the factory the shelters. During this period I went on holiday to Bristol to stay with my sister and her husband, who was a permanent staff instructor with the Territorial Searchlight Battery. I remember being taken round the Searchlight Battery sites when they were exercising, with R.A.F. aircraft acting as targets. And I was struck by the sense of urgency in the realism with which the practices were conducted. This brought home to me the fact that a real expectation of war existed. In August 1939, further signs emerged of the build-up to war, aggravated as Hitler put further pressure for a settlement of the Polish question. With his demands for access to the Baltic through the Danzig corridor, a number of reservists began to be called for duty, and a number of factory workers from my own factory, who were in territorial units, were called to the colours. The tension mounted, and on the 1st of September I well remember coming home for lunch, and my mother telling us that the news had just come through that Hitler had invaded Poland that morning on a massive scale. I felt a sickly feeling in my stomach when I realized that war was now about to break out. We expected that if it did, a massive air raid on London would take place almost immediately, a fear that was proved to be unfounded at that stage. The next 2 days were one of apprehension and tension, as the British government delivered an ultimatum to Hitler to withdraw from Poland. On Sunday morning the 3rd of September at 11 a.m. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made his historic statement that no response to our ultimatum had been received from Hitler and we were therefore in a state of war with Germany. Within 1 hour of this dramatic announcement the air raid sirens sounded and we feared the worst. However, nothing came of it, and many years later, we learned that this warning had been somewhat of a false alarm. The warning, however, had sent people all over Britain scurrying to air raid shelters, a grim example of what was to come later in the war. The factory I worked at, and lived next to, employed a number of security guards to patrol the perimeters. I came home one day and my mother said a very nice young man was patrolling the area next to our garden, and she chatted with him, and had given him a cup of tea. I asked more about him, and she said he was Ted Drake, the Arsenal England centre forward, one of my football heroes. I couldn't wait for his next trip round the perimeter and we had a thoroughly interesting chat. At this time most of the professional sportsmen took on various jobs other than their sporting pursuit. The next few months were the period of the so-called phony war, which took place during one of the coldest winters on record. News broadcasts and cinema newsreels showed the British troops entrenched in the front lines in France, facing the Germans in snow and ice and bitter conditions. The whole period seemed to be one of minor skirmishes that did not develop into any large-scale action. Of course, Hitler had conquered Poland completely and brutally in the first 3 weeks of the war. Initially, most of the real action came at sea, where the Battle of the Atlantic was fought by German submarines and surface ships, sinking thousands of tons of Allied merchant shipping. At one stage during this period, I was able to go on holidays to Filey in Yorkshire, where my father was working. One day I went to Scarborough, which had been a prime seaside resort before the war, and saw the barbed wire and entanglements, and all the seaside houses and entertainment centres being used as billets for coastal defence troops. I was fascinated to see the coastal defences, and to watch the convoys sailing up the east coast, and I remember on one occasion seeing a Sunderland on coastal patrol flying at low level up the coast. R.A.F. activity at this time was confined to dropping leaflets over Germany and air defense operations over Britain and France. During this period we also started to experience food and petrol rationing and the various shortages of all commodities one could expect to become scarce in war. We had been issued with gas masks just before the war, and these we carried at all times. In addition, we learned to move around in blackout conditions which were very restricting indeed. I was still working at Standard Telephone and Cables, and as I was only 17, I could not join the services, but it was my intention to do so as soon as I became 18. My factory was declared one in which all skilled staff was to be in a reserved occupation, which meant that we could not enlist in the armed forces. Because of this I left my job before the reservation deadline and went and joined another factory, Bellingley Radio Works in Enfield, 8 miles from where I lived. This enabled me to work without being in a reserved occupation, and allowed me, when old enough, to join the armed forces. This job was no sinecure as I had to cycle 8 miles each way, often in blackout conditions, and through the winter months. The winter of 1939-1940 passed, and as spring came the phony war quickly came to an end. Firstly, Hitler invaded Norway, and then in May 1940 overran Denmark, Holland, Belgium and France. Now we were really into it. Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister and Winston Churchill took over to inspire the British people to prepare for the Battle of Britain. It was a most dramatic period to live through, especially during the Dunkirk evacuation of the British Army. During the phony war, we had even been able to live a reasonably normal life, and I was able to play quite a bit of sport, especially soccer. I played for the Standard Telephone and Cable factory side and was considered good enough to be put forward for a trial for Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. The team playing in the first division in the London area, not far from where I lived. Unfortunately, 2 weeks before the trial, Hitler invaded France, and that put an end to my aspirations as a professional footballer. Although I was not old enough to join the armed forces, the local Defence Volunteers was established, and this was the forerunner of the Home Guard, Dad's Army. We were issued with armbands, steel helmets and broomsticks, as there was a shortage of rifles. Our section had the job of guarding our factory, where I also served as a volunteer fireman, helping to defend the factory against incendiary attack, which we were especially trained to handle. There was a special bonus in this which showed itself to good measure once the blitz started. After our working day we would go on duty as firemen, and provided there was an air raid on, we were paid double time. It was the only time I can remember being pleased to hear the air raid warning sound, and to continue all night. However, initially this did not happen as it was summer and the Battle of Britain had begun, but not the blitz on London. The summer of 1940 was a long period of beautiful weather, the countryside looked at its best, and it was hard to realize what troubles lay ahead when Hitler launched his blitzkrieg. Despite the restrictions, I was quite enjoying life, and fell in love with a girl from the office at the factory. Joan Bickle was 16, and we enjoyed a lovely relationship of innocent love, for she had high moral standards. Our main source of entertainment was visits to the cinema and to our respective families. The Battle of Britain began as France fell and the British Army was rescued from Dunkirk. We lived through a period of drama, as we listened to the miracle of the bringing home over 300,000 troops from the devastated beaches of Dunkirk. The air war gradually came closer to home, and as Churchill gave the stirring speeches to rally the British people to defend the land, there was a wonderful feeling of patriotism and comradeship whilst we steeled ourselves for the expected German invasion. I think we all felt stronger now that we were on our own, and could personally make any sacrifices to save Britain. It was a feeling of almost euphoria never to be forgotten. As a young man I felt quite inspired and patriotic. As mentioned earlier, I joined the local Defence Volunteers and became a part-time fireman, so that I could do as much as possible to defend my homeland. Gradually, we found ourselves being brought into the front line. We followed the fantastic and courageous efforts of our fighter pilots, as they flew to and from airfields and airstrips around London, to fight the huge Luftwaffe formations of fighters and bombers. It was a great thrill to see a Spitfire, or a Hurricane fly low overhead and perform victory rolls, after a successful combat. The real crunch came on the 7th of September when Goering and his Luftwaffe switched their attacks onto English Channel shipping as it passed through the Straits of Dover. The raids first hit R.A.F. airfields, and later a major attack on London was launched. These first raids continued all day and into the night. The first big raid on London was on a glorious summer's day, weather-wise, but not otherwise. I can clearly see in my memory now the vast criss-cross vapor trails as the German bomber and fighter formations were engaged by the Hurricanes and Spitfires of R.A.F. Fighter Command. The main attack by the Luftwaffe was on the London docks and, of course, up to and into the City of London. That day, after a short respite, the Luftwaffe returned at night, first to drop incendiaries in large numbers to start fires, and then with high-explosive bombs to spread the fires. Spread they did, and the whole London sky was lit up by the glow of fires, searchlights, a scene accompanied by the crashing of bombs and the sound of anti-aircraft gunfire. It was a Saturday and I was out for the evening, when I met a girl in the blackout as we both went into a public shelter. She sounded all right, but I couldn't see what she looked like, a not unusual occurrence during night raids. Finally, we left the shelter and I invited her to come home for a drink. Unfortunately, her voice was a lot better than her looks. A point my brother commented on when he said to me, "She's a bit rough for you, isn't she?" I agreed, and after seeing her on to her bus home, I set off back home rather gladly. Anyhow, I had done the decent thing. The bombers came every night, and as it was winter and dark by about 4 p.m. we expected, and were not disappointed, to hear the air raid warning sirens to sound every day at this time. You could almost set your watch by it, and the air raid warning would continue all night right up until about 8 a.m. next morning. Initially we went into the shelters as soon as the sirens sounded, but after a while we became used to the raids and only went into the shelters when we heard the German bombers droning overhead. One heard a distinctive unsynchronized engine noise, or there was increased searchlight and anti-aircraft battery firing in the area in which you were. We had also got very fed up and uncomfortable spending cold winter nights in an unheated air raid shelter in our garden. The only heat we could manage in the garden shelters was by lighting a candle and placing an earthenware flower pot over it. This afforded a very slow form of heat, but over a few hours was better than none at all. In many parts of London, especially in the centre, the extensive underground railway became the main source of shelter. People were allowed to sleep on the platforms where it was both safe and warm. They really established themselves in their particular local underground station, and every night went down and settled themselves on the platforms with bedding, food and the like. In a way it was very orderly, and there was still significant room left on the platform for the train goers to get in and out of the trains. Many people, my family included, finally resorted to giving up the garden shelter and slept instead on the ground floor in the house, the upstairs bedrooms being too dangerous. However, one night when bombs dropped close to my own house and damaged houses in the vicinity, all the plaster from the ceiling in the lounge came down on my bed, causing both me and my dog Trixie some consternation, but fortunately no injury. My father had returned from working in Yorkshire and now had a job in London. It was amazing how we adjusted to existing in this atmosphere when people still went out to cinemas, theatres and restaurants and carried on, almost as if nothing was going on. The cinemas used to flash up a warning on the screen if the bombing became too intense in the area, advising patrons to leave and go to public shelters. One very amusing incident took place when a BBC reporter was interviewing an East London Cockney lady, whose house just been completely destroyed. The reporter was commiserating with her and asked her how she would cope, and was her husband around to help. She came back with the devastating reply, "No, he's gone and joined the army, the bloody coward." Her comment had quite a point, because at this time all the enemy action was centred on London and people serving in the services in the country districts were generally pretty safe. Life in the Blitz continued unabated, but fortunately none of my relatives were killed or injured, although we all had our houses damaged in one way or another. I well remember a German Heinkel bomber fly low when I was outside our factory. As I looked up and it let go its bomb load, one could see the bombs falling. I got myself down under a wall real quick, and fortunately the bombs fell some distance away. Just before Christmas the Luftwaffe launched the most devastating raid on the City of London, and the heart of the city was ablaze. Many will recall the vivid scenes of St. Paul's Cathedral lit up, but still standing, from the holocaust of fires that surrounded this ancient edifice, the symbol of London. We in the outskirts of London could clearly see that glow from the blaze. The next morning, after the huge fires in London City were beginning to get under some sort of control, my father and I went up to the city to see the devastation. It was the scene of chaos which I shall never forget. We now knew Londoners were in the front line of the Blitz, which was to continue without relief for 3 long months. Fires were still smouldering everywhere and fire hoses crisscrossed the roads, many leaking badly. The fire brigade had to get water from the Thames as the fire engines and normal sources could not provide the vast quantity of water required. As the Blitz wore on, it became nearer to the time when I was able to think about my forthcoming 18th birthday and joining the services. My intention was to go into the Royal Navy and, in particular, as an engineer in the Fleet Air Arm. The Navy were recruiting under the age of 18, so I went, before my 18th birthday, to the Naval Recruiting Office to join up. At this point in my life, a real trick of fate occurred. I was taking the entrance examination at the Naval Recruiting Office and had almost finished writing the paper when the invigilating officer, a naval lieutenant, told us to stop writing, as they had just received a signal from the Admiralty saying that there was to be no further recruiting of boys under the age of 18. The officer apologized and told us to come back again when we reached the age of 18. Disappointingly, I went home to wait until my 18th birthday. This is where fate came in, because I went to a party and met a Battle of Britain pilot and told him of my attempt to join the Navy, and he said, "Why don't you join the R.A.F?" and I questioned what. His reply rather surprised me, for he suggested that I joined as a pilot. He subsequently convinced me that I had the necessary qualifications, which had now been reduced. So, having had my sights set on a new goal, I joined Air Training Corps and prepared myself to be recruited as air crew. My 18th birthday approached, and I told my mother that on my birthday, I was going to go to the R.A.F. recruiting office to join up. This upset her a bit, and she said, "Please don't go on your birthday," so I compromised and went the next day. I was pretty keen. In pursuit of this aim, I went on the 7th of December to the R.A.F. recruiting office on the Edgware Road and joined up. After about a couple of weeks, I was called to R.A.F. Uxbridge for 3 days of selection processing for entrance into the service as air crew. I remember being interviewed by a group captain, who asked me a number of questions, and when he said each time about becoming air crew, I interjected and emphasized, "I want to be a pilot." My insistence on this aim must have impressed him, because he finally said, "You really are determined to become a pilot, young man?" "Yes, sir," I said. After having an aircrew medical and various other processes, I was called in and told that I was selected for aircrew training, in particular to become trained as a pilot. I left Uxbridge feeling about 10 feet tall, because the chance to become an R.A.F. pilot had exceeded my wildest dreams. Only a month or so ago the idea had never entered my head, because it had seemed too high a pinnacle to achieve. Having attained this initial goal, namely, a chance to train as a pilot, I went back to work to await my call-up. Once again the risk of becoming stuck in the factory job, being classed as a reserve occupation, reared its ugly head. I therefore left Bellingley Radio Works expecting an early call to the R.A.F. I made inquiries as to how long I would expect to wait, and was advised that my pilot training could not start for some months. However, if I so wished, I could join up to do some other work in the service until I was able to begin training as a pilot, but accepting this option would not delay my flying training. I decided to accept, and was then notified that I would be called up on the 1st of March, 1941. Although this suited me fine, it meant that I would have over 2 months to await entry into the service. Remaining idle was not acceptable to me, so I took a job that would in no way be likely to become a reserved occupation. I became a baker's roundsman. My father found this rather amusing, and from then on called me the pilot baker. The work was tough, especially as winter was well set in. And the work involved pulling a baker's cart, and carting the bread and cakes etc. in big heavy baskets. This was particularly hard, as many of the calls I had to make were in high-rise flats without lifts. The first day was real initiation, because we had experienced a heavy snowfall the night before and the bread had to be hauled by sledge over the icy roads. 2 months of this tough life built me up physically, well able to cope with harsh winter conditions. An amusing aspect of the work was a sort of Robin Hood feeling. I served a mixed district of wealthy and poor areas, and found that the poor people treated me well and appreciated what I was doing whilst waiting to join up. The wealthy people treated me as if I'm menial. However, rationing was on and cakes and goodies in short supply, so this enabled me to look after the poorer people by keeping the goodies for them. The winter weather eased and I almost enjoyed the last few weeks being the pilot baker. Came the 1st of March and I said my sad farewells to my family, my girlfriend and my dear little dog Trixie. I had never been away from home, other than for holidays, and leaving my mother and family was a terrible wrench when it actually came. I was now about to embark on a career which at the time I had no idea would involve 50 years of flying in service and civilian aviation. So be it, chin up, cut the tears and press on.